Welcome to Research Talk. We are in process of learning second cycle of coding strategies. In our previous videos, we learned focused coding. Now in this video, we are going to learn another very prevalent method for second cycle of coding, which is axial coding. Axial coding, this method started by grounded theorists, and it is widely used in grounded theory research. And why it is so popular in grounded theory? Because if you remember, in grounded theory study, the focus is on developing a theory, developing a theoretical framework, understanding the social processes underlying a phenomenon. And grounded theory use axial coding to identify relationship between different themes, different codes, categories, and that's why it is very popular. So axial coding is primarily used in grounded theory, and it doesn't mean that only grounded theorists can use it. Depending on your research goals, any qualitative researcher can incorporate axial coding in their data analysis process. So as I said, what happens in axial coding, it helps you to identify relationships between codes, categories, or subcategories. So axial coding, when you start doing that, it helps you to identify the relationship between all codes or between categories or subcategories. Let's see how it looks like. So let's say you develop your initial codes. That is our first process of data analysis. And let's say you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's say generally in a typical study, we see initial codes might be somewhere between 20 to 30 or 40 codes. Let's say 40 codes. So that's your initial codes. Now, in the second round, what you do, you try to minimize the total number of codes. And when you minimize, you try to see how these various codes are in some way. There might be some similarity between codes, so you can merge those codes together. So you try to categorize, create category among all these codes. And let's say you come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, let's say 10 categories. And this is when you start the axial coding process. So now you have your initial codes, which are very large in numbers, and then you try to merge some of the codes and maybe categorize those codes based on certain themes or categories. And then you have relatively less number of codes, and you call them categories, broader. In fact, I could say category is like a broader codes. And now this is when you start, at this stage, you start the process of axial coding. And what you do, as I said previously, you try to understand the relationship between codes, categories, and subcategories. So you identify, it could be like, let's say, if I have, let's say I take category 1, and then I try to see what might be some possible subcategories. Subcategory 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we try to understand the relationship between these various categories and subcategories. Maybe let's say there is category 2. And then you want to understand the relationship between category 1 and category 2, and also between subcategories. And this happens through axial coding. So that's briefly about what an axial code is. So in Axial code, you start with, obviously, you have your initial list of codes, then you try to minimize the total number of codes. You divide them into categories or broader codes, and then you start focusing on some categories which you think have more analytical power, and then you focus on those categories. You go back to the data, you focus on those categories, you and do further coding where you try to understand, maybe find some subcategories within those categories, and try to develop a relationship. And it could be a causal relationship, maybe. So this category or this code or this particular concept is causing this concept, which leads to this concept. So you try to understand the process or the relationship between different categories and subcategories. And that is what axial coding is. Now let me show this with a real example where I can show a study, and then we can learn how it looks like in practical. So let's say I'm interested in understanding first year university students' experience of adapting to campus life. So that's what I'm interested in. And let's say to understand students' experiences of adapting to campus life, I did, let's say, a focus group interviews, and also I did individual interviews to understand their experiences and collecting the data. And during these interviews, you could say I focused on experience related to challenges and coping strategies that students apply to in the process of adapting to campus life. So that's the study that, let's say, if I'm doing that study, I'm collecting data through focus group and individual interviews. After collecting the data, I transcribed those interviews, and then I did my first initial coding. And let's say during that initial coding, I came up with certain codes and categories. So the first code, let's say, is academic pressures. Sometimes I make a mistake in the spellings. Academic pressures, so that's code 1. Code 2, let's say, is social networking. And let's say there is another code which is homesickness. So students reported experiences of homesickness. There is another code, let's say, seeking support. The student talked about what are the support, what are various sources of support they sought. And then let's say there is another code called time management. And finally, let's say there is another code called campus resources. So these are some key codes, or you can say initial codes or categories that I came up with when I analyzed the first cycle of coding process. And these are the codes which came up: academic pressures, social networking, homesickness, seeking support, on campus, off campus, time management, campus resources. These are various key codes that emerge from my initial coding. And then, as I said previously, once you have your initial code, and initial codes could be a lot in numbers, so you try to merge some of the codes which talk about similar ideas, and which we call it like, or maybe you could, another thing you could do, you can categorize your initial code in certain categories, and we call them categories. So let's say these are some codes and also some categories which came up in my initial data analysis. Now, I need to do axial coding. So how that process looks like. So for axial coding, I can look at all these categories and ask myself, which category has more analytic power that I can use to understand the relationships between categories and other subcategories. So let's say, as a researcher, I focused on this particular category, seeking support. And based on my experience analyzing the data, interviewing, and all going through the whole process, I feel that this code has more power in terms of playing the role of a key category, and then I can work on it in terms of understanding some subcategory within this key category. So let's say seeking support. Now I can go back to the data, the interviews, and then pay attention to more in-depth understanding of this code. I can go back to the excerpt, read them again, and see what might be some possible subcategories within this core category. So let's say with seeking support, which is primarily about how students, when they are first year student on campus, how they seek support. So within this main category, I can come up with subcategories. What could be? So what could be like type of support? What type of support? Uh, the second subcategory could be, it could be sources of support. And let's say the third subcategory is barriers to seeking support. And finally, outcomes of seeking support. So you see here, the main category is seeking support, which describes how first year student on university campuses, how they seek support on campus in their first year. And then this is the main category. And then we go to the subcategory, which is type of support. What type of support these student might need. And further, I could subcategorize it, let's say, emotional support. Another could be academic support. Another could be peer mentoring. And the type of support could be financial aid. So you see, I developed the subcategory type of support further. So seeking support, the first subcategory is type of support, emotional support, academic support, peer mentoring, and financial aid. Similarly, I can further develop with further analysis sources of support. What might be some possible sources of support? So let's say in my data, I came up with family support. Second is friends. Third kind of sources of support is, let's say, academic advisors. And the support could be student organizations on campus. So sources of support: family, friends, academic advisors, student organization. I can also add another support, sources of support, which is university counselors. Now, moving to the third subcategory, barriers to seeking support. What might be some possible barriers to seeking support? And under this category, I can say stigma. I can put, let's say, lack of information on campus. Another barrier I could, let's say, which came up from the data is fear of judgment. And finally, the last subcategory under seeking support is outcome of seeking support. So, what are the outcomes when a student seeks support on campus? And I can subdivide it into modes. So, one is like outcome is like impact on academics. So, how seeking support on campus help them in their academic performance. Performance. The impact on another thing, social support, social not support, integration on campus, social integration, and finally, I can say overall well-being. So you notice that I started with the main category, like one category which I think has a more analytic power to explain the phenomenon. So I use this one, and then I go back to the data and try to develop more subcategories around it. Seeking support, type of support, sources of support, barriers to seeking support, and outcomes of seeking support. Now, finally, and these are various uh, types of support, which is emotional support, academic support, peer mentoring, financial aid, sources of support, family, friends, academic advisors, student organization, university counselors. And then barriers to seeking support, which is stigma, lack of information on campus about the facilities available, and fear of judgment. And finally, the outcome of seeking support, which is impact on the academic performance of the student, these first-year students, and their experience of being integrated to the social community on campus, and their overall well-being on campus. Now, once I have developed these subcategories, now, as I said, that axial coding is about finding connections, finding relationships between categories and subcategories. So here, see, this is the main category, if I could say, and these are subcategories, and how they are related, how they influence each other. What is, so I'm going to create a diagram which in a way will show you the connections, the relationships between categories and subcategories, which is actually the axial coding is about finding connections between categories and subcategories. So let me rub it off and then I can come up with the relationship chart that I wanted to show it with you. All right, so the final task in axial coding is to finding relationship, establishing relationship in axial coding, and you could see these are the categories and subcategories that we have developed as part of the axial coding process. So what I could do, let me create seeking support. That's our category. And I'm putting here types of support and sources of support. And then in the middle, I'm putting barriers. And here, outcome of support. So seeking support is the main category. And how do you see, so let me put it, types of support. So emotional support, academic support, peer mentor, financial aid, and then sources of support, your family, friends, uh, university, counselors, student organizations. So these are various. And in the middle, this is a barrier, which is stigma, fear of judgment, lack of information, fear of judgment. These are the barriers. Should have used another color marker to make it more. So in the outcome. Now, in this diagram, what I'm saying is types of support, sources of support and types of support, they are trying to meet with each other, but in the middle, the problem is created by the barriers. And the barriers are the one which can influence the outcome. So this is not the only way to sort of putting out the relationship, but this is what I could see, that types of support, sources of support, if they meet, then there will be a good adaptation on campus. But if the barriers are not addressed, which is stigma, lack of information, fear of judgment, if we can address these issues, then the sources of support and types of support will meet together, and then that will influence the outcome. So there will be positive outcome if the barriers are addressed effectively, and if not, then it will influence the outcome, and it might lead to either negative outcome or positive outcome. So here you see a connection that barriers influence the outcome of adaptation process. And that's sort of a relationship that we could develop here as part of our axial coding. And after we develop this, we can continue this axial coding process with other main codes or main categories, and we can develop connections not only between the categories and subcategories, but also we can develop connections between categories, one category to another category to another category to subcategories. So in a way, you are like developing connections. So if it is your main category, then let's say subcategory, 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 and then also you might have another main category here. So the connections between these various subcategories to themselves with others, and this is what axial coding helps you do, that to understand the connections the relationships between various codes, subcodes, categories, subcategories, and all these relationships will help you finally to develop a theoretical framework. And this is why grounded theory researchers use this axial coding axial coding process a lot, because at the end of the grounded theory, they want to develop a theory that can explain the process, that can explain what they are studying. And axial coding helps them understand the relationship between various pieces, various categories, subcategories, and then that leads to further development of a theoretical framework or theory. So let's recap it. So axial coding is a powerful technique, second cycle coding strategy, which we use to understand relationship between various codes, categories, subcategories, themes, if you can want to use the word theme. And by understanding the relationship, you can develop a theoretical framework that can explain the overall social process, the overall phenomenon that you are studying. So that's why axial coding is a powerful tool to use in qualitative research. I hope this explanation, this example would have helped you to understand when to use axial coding, how to use axial coding to code your data and develop relationships between codes and develop your theoretical framework and ultimately your grounded theory. Thank you very much, and I'll see you again in another video about second cycle of coding process.